Boys and girls and boys, how the hell are we? It's Max here, and I am looking at the 2010 exam today. And just FYI, I think this is probably one of the earliest exams you can go back to before they just stop making any sense. I mean, prior to 2010, the VCAA language analysis articles are just shocking. They're just so bad. Like half of them don't even make sense, and they're so weird as well. Like they're just talking about, you know, fax machine. I don't know. They're just so out of touch with modern society. But this one's quite good. This one honestly could have been the 2016 or the 2017. It's very standard. It's only got one article, but it's still good practice to do. But the fact of the matter is, if you can do one article well, you can do two. A lot of students get really worried about comparative. How do I do two articles? And the truth is that it's really just analyzing one article for maybe 50-60% of your essay, then analyzing the second article in response to the first, and using a few bits of connective language. While the first article does this, the second article does this, and then explaining what the second article does. I actually think it's easier doing comparative because you have way more to analyze. With this one, you've only got one article, and for a lot of students, that's not a problem. There's a lot to analyze here, but you might run out of stuff. And with both articles, with multiple, you don't have that. In any case, what I'm saying is totally irrelevant to the task at hand, which is 2010. So make sure you've read this before we talk about this. And I've talked about this article in tutoring quite a bit, so I don't think I'm going to be going over anything totally new. But I guess this is just good for posterity, for future students to have a look at. Alright, so as always, start with the background information. What does it tell us? Well, tells us heaps. This background information was really useful. It tells us basically the topic of concern of the piece, which is basically, and by reading this we can figure out what the contention is. Well, we get a much better idea, a hint of what it's going to be. It tells us that in 2002 a commitment was made to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss. And the purpose of today's conference is to review progress. So we know when we read this that the contention, the main argument, central motivation underlying the text is going to be one of two things. It's either going to be that the people who made this commitment, which we learn in the article, are nations, right? Nations, member nations who are part of this commitment. Member nations, and I'll show you where we learn that in the article if you don't see, but he says member nations. Member nations made this commitment, and we know the contention is either going to be, okay, you failed to uphold your commitment, or you didn't fail and we did uphold it. All we're told here is that they're going to review, that Professor Lee's going to review. So he's going to come to the conclusion, the contention of either they did or they didn't uphold their commitment. And obviously they didn't from the article. But basically, since we know that he's saying that, hey, look, this wasn't good enough, we need to do more, we didn't uphold our commitment, we could basically frame our contention just in these terms. So for example, I didn't put the topic of concern in this piece because there is only one text. Usually I just write the topic of concern is blah 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 if there are multiple texts. So check out other essays I've given you where there are multiple texts, because that's when I go, okay, the topic of concern. In this bit, I've just skipped the contextual statement. I've never liked the contextual statement. I don't think it does anything for the essay unless you've got multiple texts, in which case it's useful to identify the point of issue. Like, imagine if this image was a completely not part of this presentation and was a different kind of article or text in its own right. Then it would be useful for going, the topic of concern or the point of issue, the debate between the two texts is blah, blah, blah. But in this case, we've just got one. It's a bit redundant to say the topic of concern. So instead, I jumped straight into the contention. In his keynote speech at the International Biodiversity Conference in 2010, got the date there, got the title, taking stock, got the name, Professor Lee contends. Always say contends, it's just much simpler. And it keeps you orientated to identifying the core argument. I see way too many students, really good students as well, who get really high marks, actually giving all these reasons for the contention in their introduction, which is totally unnecessary. It's totally unnecessary. All you have to do is identify the core contention. In this case, that member nations have failed to fulfill their commitment to significantly reduce the rate of biodiversity loss. That's the contention. You don't need to give all the reasons why. I see so many students, even students who get 50. This is the thing. You can do this. You can go, he contends that blah blah blah, and he reasons or he appeals to their sense of whatever. You can do all that. It's just a waste of time because it's not required of you. All that's required of you is to say the contention. And what it means is if you start identifying reasons and appeals to and techniques he relies upon in your introduction, like so many really good students actually do, you're just taking time away from the rest of your article. And for some students, this might not be a problem, but I guess the principle is why do something if it's totally unnecessary? Give yourself the best chance of winning, and to do that, just do what's required. You will. This is an A+ introduction. But there are two contentions in this piece. It is kind of the tricky thing here. So his first contention is that they failed to uphold this 2002 commitment. But that's not all he argues. If that was all he argues, he would just be giving reasons why they have failed. But he also argues that more needs to be done. He kind of starts talking about why more needs to be done going forward. He starts telling them that biodiversity is so important. He doesn't really need to say this. If he was trying to just prove that they've failed to fulfill their earlier commitment, he doesn't need to be saying why biodiversity is important. He just needs to say, hey, look, we said we were going to do this, and we didn't. Check out the environment. All the mangrove trees are gone and species are going extinct. But instead, he kind of slides into the secondary contention, which is that more needs to be done, basically going forward. Given the fact that we have failed to uphold our commitment, we need to do more. And you might say that's the overriding contention. And strictly speaking, actually it is. Really the overriding contention is just going forward, member nations need to do more to protect biodiversity. But I thought it useful to include this idea that they've failed to uphold their commitment, because that's really the motivation behind the speech. So look, yeah, I'm a little torn. I went with basically there's two central kind of ideas or themes or contentions of the piece. But usually you're only going to have one. So this is the exception to the rule. Just be aware of that. So second contention, Lee also calls upon his audience, representatives of member nations, to make more forceful action towards preserving biodiversity in the future. So very simple. Harking back to what I just said about good students overcomplicating the introduction, the contentions are always so simple. So simple. They're always just like, okay, something bad happened, or we need to do this. That's all it ever is. And in this case, we see both of those types. We see Chris Lee going, look, something bad, we stuffed up. We didn't do what we said we're going to do. And then him going, we need to do more. We need to do X. We need to preserve biodiversity more. Now, I don't need to give all the reasons why, that he thinks biodiversity is like a treasure, that it's important, that the survival of the poor depends on upholding biodiversity. All that stuff can come later on in my analysis. Okay, first bit. As always, I generally, as a matter of habit, I've fallen into start off my analysis by starting with just like the start of the piece. It's kind of like, it's what I find is quite easy to do. But you can start anywhere. And when I was in year 11, year 12, I didn't do that. But excuse me. All right, that was my alarm. Okay, so Lee, how does he start his speech? Well, he starts his speech with a series of questions. Has this been a year of celebration? How well have we done? We see this here. You know, not there. Has this been a year of blah, 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 year of action? Honestly, how well have we done? All these questions in the first kind of section of his speech. Why? Why does he do that? That's always the question. Why start off this way? I mean, couldn't he have just started off with a really aggressive? He could have started off by going this. Um, what have you guys done? He could have been more aggressive about it. He could have said, he could have started off by going, biodiversity loss undermines the food security, nutrition, and health of the poor. He could have kind of just started in that way and built off from there. Instead of he started off with this kind of, we might say, genial sort of questions. He started off in a sort of somewhat friendly, peaceful, kind of calm tone. Has this been a year of action or not? Kind of just putting the audience at ease, just asking a friendly sort of question. So why? These questions serve to invite his audience to consider whether or not they think their commitment to reduce biodiversity has been successful. Okay, so it's inviting the audience to consider their own actions, to consider it themselves. The intended effect on the audience is that rather than being forced to adopt a certain opinion, the audience is given space to contemplate on their own terms whether sufficient action has been made. If Lee had begun his speech with a strident declaration of blame, he may have risked arousing resentment in his audience and possibly alienating them. All right, this is really important because analyzing a question, a rhetorical question, most students do it really badly. But these sort of questions, you generally see writers asking these sort of questions in their articles. A lot of the time, not always, a lot of the time writers will ask a question. Why? Why do they do that? Well, one reason they do that is to not alienate, it's to include their audience in the speech or the article. It's to effectively include them. It's an inclusive tactic. It's almost like using inclusive language in a way, right? It's basically going, okay, I'm going to invite you to consider this issue with me. I'm not going to force this issue down your throat. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm going to invite you to come to your own conclusion. And why might this be persuasive? Well, a lot of people don't like being told what to believe, being forced to adopt a certain opinion. A lot of people like being given the space to contemplate an issue, right? And in fact, if Lee had begun his speech with a strident declaration of blame, which is what he ends up kind of doing later, he kind of builds up to this broader idea, which is that, look, we've failed and we need to do more. You guys have stuffed up big time. We haven't achieved our goals. You've done nothing. We know that's his contention, but he starts off much more friendly. And the reason is that if he'd started off in this more aggressive way, he may have annoyed his audience. He may have pissed them off. He may have alienated them. No one likes being attacked, right? So in contrast, by inviting the audience to consider the topic of discussion, he effectively includes his audience in the speech. He's including them. Very powerful technique. Very powerful indeed. This more democratic mode of delivery, right? The audience isn't told what to think. The audience is kind of is given the opportunity to opt in, given the opportunity to formulate their own sort of opinion, right? And I'm going to say later on that actually Lee kind of guides their opinion, but he gives them an opening, right? And a lot of people might like that. So this more democratic mode of delivery, in which audience members become allies cooperating in the shared contemplation of an issue. Okay, what I mean by this is it's building off this idea that they haven't been forced to adopt a certain opinion, but actually they've been given the right to kind of consider the issue at hand on their own terms. And so they kind of become, almost in a way, have they not? They've become equal partners to Professor Lee, right? He proposes this question as if he doesn't quite know the answer himself yet, as if he's asking the audience for an answer. What do you guys think? And so he's almost, I didn't say this, but I could have, he's diminishing his own authority and elevating the authority of the audience upwards. Very powerful technique, and it may therefore endear Lee towards those members of the audience who value the opportunity, right, of being included, indirectly involved in the speech. This unit of analysis, this paragraph rather, can be replicated if you see this sort of thing being done in other articles, which I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will in other articles, and I've seen it myself, where the writer will ask questions. Don't just stop at rhetorical question, identify. You don't, I mean, that's just so boring, and everyone does it, and you won't get any marks for identifying it's a rhetorical question. You will get marks by doing what was done here, what I did here, by really going into why asking a question can be persuasive. So take note of that. All right, moving on, onwards and upwards. The inclusivity of Lee's opening question, right? It's inclusive. It's strengthened by particular uses of language, such as work with you. All right, just before we talk about this, just take note. You'll see my essays. I do this all the time. I'll go like between paragraphs. I'll go, okay, here's the paragraph. This, the inclusivity of Lee's opening question. I mean, I could have just wrote, or I'll write like this. I'll refer back to something. I'll be like, referring back to this, or the inclusivity of Lee's opening question is strengthened by, is compounded by, and then I'll talk about this new technique. It's very, very simple. You've probably done it yourself. This, and you're referring back to something, is compounded, strengthened by, there you go, new persuasive strategy, appeal, technique, whatever. And what you've done is you've established a link between the persuasive strategies of the piece. You've established a kind of interrelationship, and it's really easy to do. It's not. It's just going, okay, here was one technique, and actually, you know what? That technique is strengthened. Its persuasive value is increased by this new persuasive technique. And it's a neat little trick, and it's surprisingly easy to do. So there you go. Back to the sentence. So I'm saying that the inclusivity of these questions that Lee has tried to establish, to give the audience, to include them in his speech, is strengthened by particular uses of language, such as work with you. I can't remember where he says that in this piece. You might have to find it yourself. Oh, there you go. Work with you to re-establish. Okay, what does this imply? Well, it implies Lee is motivated not to actively persuade the audience, but to collaborate and operate alongside his audience towards a greater goal. Okay, well, what does that suggest in turn? Remember, language analysis is a sequence of suggestions. Forget about persuasive techniques. You have two things you need to do. Identify what's being suggested by a particular use of language, and identify what the effect might be. And sophisticated analysis. What is sophisticated language analysis? Sophisticated language analysis is simply a multiple sequence of suggestions. So it goes, here's the language. This language implies or suggests this. And this suggestion, in turn, this suggestion suggests this. Okay, I said serves to. I could have just said suggests. I could have said further, this suggests, okay, I have to rewrite it, but I could have said something like this. I just want you to understand that when I say this serves to bridge Actually, this is just another sort of suggestion, really. This suggests a degree camaraderie between the two parties, between the audience and Lee, potentially uniting them. Blah blah blah. That's terrible spelling, that one. Potentially uniting them. So I could have just rewritten. My point is, I could have rewritten this sentence in terms of suggestion, but I said this serves to bridge the divide between the audience and Lee, the speaker, by instilling a degree of camaraderie. It suggests camaraderie. Work with you, right? Suggests first that he's collaborating and operating alongside his audience, right? If you're collaborating and operating alongside someone, perhaps that suggests a degree of camaraderie, and that this camaraderie could potentially bridge the divide between the audience and Lee, ultimately uniting them with a common interest, biodiversity reduction. So this is all the suggestions. This is the suggestion stage. Well, what might the effect be? Well, the effect is, notice how clear it is. I'm telling you what it is. The effect is that Lee implicitly defines the relationship between himself and the audience as one of cooperation, which may render some audience members more conducive to adopting his argument, kind of buttering them up later for his more active attempts at persuasion. He defines a relationship. Okay, relationships are defined all the time, whether or not you realize. When you walk into school and you walk into your teacher's classroom, automatically a relationship between you and the teacher has been defined. The teacher's been defined in a position of authority, and you've been defined as his student. And similarly, you're being defined in relation to the rest of the students. So you guys are all students, your peers. That's the relationship you share. You've been defined by that. Well, that's what Lee's effectively doing here. He's defining a relationship between himself and the audience, and he's defining the relationship as collaborative, as one of allies, as one of camaraderie. Not as antagonists, not as people butting heads, arguing against each other like we see in the Parliament of Australia and we see in the news, but as people working together to solve a common interest, with a common interest and towards a greater goal. Very clever what he does, very, very clever. Implicitly defines relationship, and what might this effect be? Well, it might make audience members kind of feel at ease. It might make them more conducive to later persuasion, right? They've been butted up. They've been told by Lee, Lee's basically said, look, guys, I just want to include you in this discussion. What do you think? Blah, blah, blah. He hasn't actually made any active sort of argument here. He's just asking them. Kind of what it does is it puts the audience at ease a bit, relaxes them. I mean, they may have been thinking, okay, oh God. I mean, they would have all known. We know that we probably haven't done enough. And now we've got this guy, he's going to review progress. What's he going to do? They might have been thinking. He's probably going to tell us how bad we are. Oh no. Instead, Lee starts very cleverly by going, what do you guys reckon? Have we done this or have we not? I want you to collaborate, be involved. We're on the same side. So very clever. He kind of butters his audience up, relaxes them, butters them up for later, more active attempts of persuasion. And I'm going to talk about this more active attempts at persuasion. And I'll briefly just preempt what I'm going to say by just noting that there are kind of two broad sections in this article. It's very useful if you can identify it. And the first sort of section is this sort of more friendly section. How well have we done? What have we done? And then the second section is the rest of the piece, which is basically, we have failed dramatically and you guys all suck. You've done nothing. It's just been platitudes upon platitudes. And guess what? Now the environment is suffering, the poor are suffering, the species are suffering. Is this new information? No, you guys all knew that. You know what damage your lifestyle does. So the first half is sort of friendly, the second half is antagonistic and aggressive. So I'll talk about that in a sec. But first, the image. This effort to inspire a sense of cooperation from his audience is amplified. Again, this is exactly what I did here. I did this, blah, 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 is strengthened by, and here I referred back to this paragraph and said, well, the main point of this paragraph, the effort to inspire cooperation from his audience is amplified or strengthened or whatever by the opening image, which functions partly to remind audience members of the capacity for humanity to cooperate successfully with the natural forces. This image, there's a lot to analyze in this image actually. So let's go through a bit of it. The embedment of flora and fauna, which just means plants, animals and plants and animals, alongside a father and his son, within the overarching numbers of 2010, is an idealization of what 2010 was supposed to represent, right? It was supposed to be the successful achievement of the 2002 commitment to uphold biodiversity, right? When they made this commitment, they were making a commitment to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss by 2010. So one might say that this is the idealization of the original motivation for the commitment back in 2002. Very kind of beautiful, friendly sort of image. A man and his son holding hands, a flamingo next to fish, next to a tree. Very utopian, which I talk about here. Further, the soft curvatures of the numbers combined with the gentle gradations in tone between white, grey and black imply a harmonious and congenial mode of existence. Okay, here I really go to town. I got a little carried away. The soft curvatures of the numbers. You might be thinking, what the hell? Combined with the gentle gradations in tone in white, grey and black imply a harmonious and congenial mode of existence, heightening the implication of utopia. All right. Curves represent, signify, whatever, flow. They're non-aggressive. I mean, it could have been put in jagged lines. He could have done the two with kind of jagged, sharp lines. Jagged, sharp lines kind of suggest more aggressiveness, cutting. Yeah, curved lines are friendlier. So that's just a little thing to remember. And also the colours, they're all, well, actually, they're not colours, they're tones, are they? There's nothing kind of at odds with each other. They're all along the same spectrum. And in a sense, they're all kind of in harmony with each other. The whites, the greys, the blacks, they kind of melt into one another. They're all just a few, they're very close to one another. And what I mean by that is green and purple, they're disparate, distinct colours. Grey and black and white, they're all in the same kind of category, right? They're all just different gradations of light. And so it's maybe it's a testament to what was supposed to be the close relationship between, the animals and humanity, and the plants and the local environment and humanity, how we're all part of the same category, life. We're all part of the same world. We're not disparate creatures at odds with each other, but we're fundamentally similar. So that's the idea here. A harmonious and congenial mode of existence, heightening the implication of utopia inherent in the flora, fauna, and human beings standing alongside one another. The fact, so yeah, this is the point of, I mean, when have you seen a flamingo next to fish, next to humans? You don't see that. This is utopia going on here. This is a dream. The fact that all the characters in the image are white and of relatively similar height further plays into this idea of utopia by suggesting equality. All characters are equally important. So the flamingo is white, the fish is white, the trees are white, and the humans are white. They are equal. Humans aren't coloured in, they're no more important than the rest of the characters in the image, especially considering the fact that all the characters are of relatively similar height. The flamingo and the tree, relatively similar height to the adult, and the trees and the the waves and the fish, relatively similar height to the small boy. This is an equal world we're seeing. Humans are not coloured in, nor are they of larger size than the rest of the characters. Okay, so this appeal to egalitarianism, right, that all have fundamental rights, very important concept, may provoke a more charitable treatment of the natural environment by audience members. Why? Well, they may be inspired to view animals and plants as deserving of greater consideration than was previously given. So the idea here is that if, as this image is suggesting, we are all equal, animals, plants, and humans are equal, then shouldn't we treat animals and plants, our local environment, like we treat each other? Shouldn't we treat them well? If we're going to hold the hand of our son, should we not extend that hand out to the flamingo and to the tree and so forth? So it's inspired. Inspired is a key word here. It's really trying to inspire. It's idealizing, and through that idealization, trying to inspire a more charitable treatment of the natural environment, greater consideration, we might say. Okay, beginning from the sixth paragraph. Sadly, this is what I was talking about before. Lee shifts to a more forceful mode of delivery, which is here. That's when the shift really happens. All the rest before here is just fluff. It's just him asking questions, buttering up his audience, right? Telling his audience, "Hey guys, just relax. We're all in this together. Let's ask some questions." And then bam, he hits them with the, actually, you know what? We've lost 35% of mangroves, 40% of forests, 50% of wetlands. Everything's, to be blunt, fucked. Okay, so why does he do this? Having invited the audience to consider a question, I must say, I think this is probably the most persuasive VCAA text I've ever read. It's very well written. I was very impressed with the person who wrote this. Having invited the audience to consider a question, he then provides them with a blunt answer. We have lost 35% of mangroves, 40% of forests, blah, blah, blah. This shift from an inviting style of argument to a more dictatorial, he's dictating them now what the answer is. He's telling them, actually, no, things aren't good, is an attempt to soften up the audience so that they are less resistant when a more strident and controversial claim is made, raising the likelihood of Lee's overall argument succeeding. So what I mean by this, I'm saying here that the shift from inviting style to a more dictatorial style was an attempt to kind of soften the audience up. So started off inviting, soften them up, and then shift to the more dictatorial. So that when that shift occurs, the more strident and controversial claim is more believable in a way. It's more believable because they're less resistant towards it. They've been buttoned up, they've been softened, and now that you're softened, I'm going to change my tone. I'm going to become aggressive and just knock you down. And that raises the likelihood of the overall argument succeeding. Such a strategy reaches its climax in the eighth paragraph, in which the previous genial use of questioning is converted into an aggressive line of attack. Yeah, what have you and your country actually done? Interesting here, very interesting, because before the questions were inclusive, they were cooperative, collaborative, there was a degree of camaraderie that we're all on the same side. Here, they shift to accusations of blame, clear accusations. Still a question, but aggressive, domineering. We've got capital F you and your. No longer does Lee shield his argument with inclusive language. Rather, he bears the full force of the capitalized personal and possessive pronoun to demand rather than invite the audience to accept that they have failed to uphold their commitment. So the personal and possessive pronoun, that's you and your. A little bit of meta language there. Can you imagine him saying this at the start of his piece? No. It's all very like, what have we done? In fact, it doesn't even mention agents or people. It just says, has this been a year? Has this, in fact? Now he focuses in on the people. What have your country done? No longer shielding them, but attacking them. Very clear shift in tone. While this climax may risk angering some audience members who potentially feel attacked, it may also work to provoke other audience members out of their possible complacent and actionless attitude towards biodiversity, thereby reminding them that more must be done. I think this was a powerful thing to do here where I segregated those audience members who may be persuaded and those who aren't. I've been asking students to do this more and more because I've come to realize that persuasiveness has no value until it's actually, persuasiveness directly depends on the audience, right? You can analyze all the suggestions of the piece, but if you're not analyzing how the suggestions might be received by the audience, then you're not actually analyzing. So, for example, some members of the audience might respond differently to other members. Some members might not like this, right? Remember, they're at this International Biodiversity Conference. It's a formal affair. And now some professor gets up on stage and tells the representatives of the nations there that, hey, you guys have been doing nothing. It's just been a talk fest. Okay, they may not like that. Some, though, some members of the audience may actually not find that a problem. So I just need to find the bit where. So segregating between the two, very powerful, because you're showing the examiner you've properly considered the persuasive value of what you're analysing in terms of its effect on different members of the audience. So complacency is key here, that's the key word. And it's also kind of a reminder, you might say. Okay, indeed, Lee layers his more dictatorial delivery with particularly evocative adjectives. Again, this is exactly what I did in the previous ones. In that topic sentence there, this effort is amplified by, strengthened by, and here I'm going, it's layered by. They're all really the same way of saying. The first technique is kind of changed or influenced or made stronger in its effect by this second technique. So Lee layers his more dictatorial delivery, discussed in the previous paragraph, with a particularly evocative use of adjectives and nouns. Thoughtless, that's a noun. The term thoughtless, as seen in due to our own thoughtless actions. Well, what does this suggest? Well, it implies that past human actions have not been sufficiently thought through. Pretty simple. This creates an image of an uncaring and inconsiderate society, heedless to the negative consequences of their actions on the natural environment. Again, layers of suggestion. First layer implies this, X, that past human beings have not been sufficiently thought through. Second layer, this in turn suggests, or this creates an image, just synonyms there, this suggests or creates an image of an uncaring and inconsiderate society, heedless to the negative consequences, blah, blah, blah. This image may conflict with audience members' aspirations for a thoughtful and caring society. So again, I define the audience members who may be persuaded by this, right? It may conflict with some audience members' aspirations for a thoughtful and caring society, thereby prompting them to adopt Lee's secondary contention that more must be done to protect biodiversity. Remember, this saying that thoughtless, that your actions have been thoughtless, isn't really going to persuade anyone who doesn't value their own actions having some kind of degree of thoughtfulness or consideration. And indeed, it's going to impact those who really value the most their actions having a lot of thoughtfulness. So identifying which members of the audience are going to be most persuaded is very, very important here. I don't think language analysis can really properly be done without it. So it may conflict and may prompt those people who really care or really aspire for a thoughtful and caring society to change their actions. Further, another term, another evocative adjective, a term such as grip, as seen in we are in the grip of a species extinction, functions to remind the audience of the extent that human action has sabotaged biodiversity. Okay, suggesting. Now we get to the second layer of suggestion. So the first layer was the term grip suggests or functions to remind the audience of, suggests the extent that human action has sabotaged biodiversity. So a lot of the time I won't exactly say suggest, but it basically means the same thing. I'm saying that grip suggests or implies that human beings have really damaged biodiversity, have sabotaged biodiversity. I just put functions to remind the audience here because it's a slightly different way of saying the same thing. And that this further suggests that the rate of species extinction has become so severe that humans are now effectively helpless to it within its grip. That's how you do sophisticated analysis. You go through layers of suggestion. You go deep, don't go wide. Just analyze a few quotes per paragraph and move on. Deep, not wide. Because it's a rule of thumb. It's always the case. I've found that the worse the student is at language analysis, the more quotations they have. Really, really good students barely ever quote hardly anything. They don't get through much of the text. And the reason is because they're analyzing sophisticatedly. They're analyzing with sophistication. And to analyze it with sophistication, you must go deep. Okay, you can't just be quoting every Tom, Dick, and Harry, because part of sophistication is actually figuring out what are the multiple layers of suggestion going on. And to do that, you have to go down, you have to go deep. Alrighty, so this undermines the common perception of human beings as powerful commandeers of their local environment. So again, just more suggestions, going deeper and deeper and deeper. I said that grip suggests that humans are effectively helpless to the rate of extinction going on with animals. Okay, well, if you're effectively helpless to something, then you're not powerful, are you? You've lost your power. And we usually consider human beings kind of powerful, as kind of in control of their environment. Well, the writer's saying here actually, he's suggesting that you've lost that position. You're no longer powerful commandeers of your local environment. And that this may potentially inspire concern from those members of the audience who take pride in the human species' capacity to control. Again, I've specified which members of the audience may be persuaded. And it's going to be those who value precisely what Lee is suggesting has been taken away, their position as powerful agents able to control. That's going to freak them out, and they're going to potentially want to adopt Lee's contention to do more to protect biodiversity. All right, last body paragraph. Talk about the final image. Further, despite the suggestion that the rate of biodiversity levels has potentially reached uncontrollable levels, Lee is careful to note the extreme influence human beings ultimately hold over their natural environment. So I'm kind of contradicting my past point a little bit here. I say that Lee suggests that human beings have kind of lost control over the rate of extinction, that biodiversity loss has become so bad we're effectively helpless to it. But I also acknowledge the fact that Lee is making a kind of different suggestion in the last image, which is that we actually, inevitably, ultimately, we do hold extreme power over our planet and biodiversity. And we see this in the concluding image, which functions as a poignant reminder of the control humanity exerts over nature, that nature is effectively within our hands. So by reducing Earth to a small globe that fits within the span of a adult palm, Lee reverses the standard conception of Earth as a huge entity, in which we humans are minuscule in comparison. This change in relative size signals a change in relative power between humans and the natural environment. This is a very important point. It's obviously this image is not true in the sense that we exist within the world. The world doesn't exist within our hands. He's reversed the standard positions that we hold to one another. Okay, no longer is the environment the most powerful one in which we inhabit. Actually, the earth inhabits our palms. Totally reverse the relationship we hold to our local environment. So, what is the effect of this suggestion? What's the effect of this suggestion? Not only might this increase awareness in the audience of the outsized effects their actions can have. All right, so, just moving a little pinky or finger in this hand is going to, potentially impact a whole continent. So the point is that we have a lot of influence, outsized effects on biodiversity. It might also evoke the sense that the natural environment deserves our protection, since it depends on a careful handling of it to survive. So this is a moral argument. This is saying the image is suggesting that since we are holding the earth is therefore dependent on our hands or on us for its survival, for its prolonging. And if we were to just slip one hand away and then the other two, the earth would fall to the ground and potentially shatter. So without us, biodiversity cannot exist. And that therefore, doesn't it sort of deserve our protection? Do we have a moral obligation to look after it? Well, this suggests humanity holds a moral obligation towards its natural environment, which may inspire a more ethically minded consideration in audience members of their nation's actions, thereby motivating them to support Lee's call for a more fervent attempt to uphold biodiversity. So he's saying that we should be protecting our Earth and that this is an ethical consideration. So in suggesting that we should be protecting our Earth, he's kind of appealing to or trying to inspire a more ethically minded audience. He's trying to get them to tap into their ethics, their moral side, and see that they actually have a moral obligation to biodiversity. For if we don't look after biodiversity, it cannot survive. All right. Conclusion, very quickly, generally I don't do this. I don't know why I did this here. But generally, you don't need to just say what the contentions are again. You can just say what were the kind of basic features you thought the writer used to persuade. And so you can go something like this. Lee advances two contentions, A and B, blah, 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 through, and then you just pick out a few kind of main themes or ways you talked about his way of persuading. Through attentiveness to the way a shift between contrasting tones can be used to persuade. That was a big part of what I talked about. And also while drawing upon visual media to deepen the meanings of the claims he made in his speech. So the conclusion doesn't really matter. You just want to give a kind of brief sort of tokenistic appeal to what you've talked about. In any case, I think this essay was potentially 1,000 or so words, 900. Don't need to write that much as long as you're writing with quality. And just remember, there's only 2 steps to language analysis. What are its suggestions? What is the effect? All right, talk to you guys soon in tutoring.